So this is a gas mask used to protect against chemical weapons.
So there were tens of thousands of these masks and more than 100,000 bunkers built by this crazy paranoid guy because he was convinced that the whole world is trying to destroy him and his country. So if you look at this country from the outside, this looks like any other European country with fancy cars on the streets and wild techno parties at night. But not so long ago, the people of this country suffered from one of the most repressive totalitarian regimes,
bloodiest regimes of contemporary history,
where this paranoid dictator made sure that no one could get in or out of the country for 40 years and no information got in or out of the country. And any person that disagreed with him was either imprisoned or killed. Today we're going to discuss the fascinating story of communist Albania. So right now I am in Tirana, which is the capital city of Albania. And the history of this place stretches back thousands of years, so we're not going to have time to cover all that. So in this video, we're just going to focus on the last 110 years or so. Now for centuries, this place was ruled by the Ottomans, but then in 1912, exactly 110 years ago, Albania finally got its independence from the Ottomans. And for the first time ever, it was ruled by its own people. So right now I'm in this neighborhood near the very center called Blokku, which is today the hippest district in all of Tirana. This is where you have all the fancy bars, all the biggest clubs and everything. More importantly, right now I'm standing in front of this house, which is the former residence of, without a doubt, the most crucial person in shaping this country's modern history. This guy that went by the name of Enver Hoxha. Now Hoxha was born in 1908, 4 years before Albania became independent from the Ottomans. He was born to a merchant family in the city of Gjirokastër, the hilly city in the south, if you remember from the last video. And he went studying around Europe for a couple of years, then came back to Albania and then became a French teacher and was working here in Albania in the 1930s. Now if you look at the map, Albania is right next to Italy. And in the 1930s, Italy was being ruled by this crazy murderous fascist guy named Benito Mussolini, who wanted to take over basically half of Europe and recreate this Italian empire that used to exist thousands of years ago. By the way, not only was Mussolini an evil conqueror, he was also one of the most incompetent military leaders in the history of the 20th century warfare, I want to say. So in April 1939, as a part of his plan to take over this area of Europe, Mussolini and Italy invaded Albania. And they took over it pretty fast because they were outnumbering the Albanian army 40-1. So in response to the Italian invasion, Hoxha joined the Communist Party of Albania in 1941. And in 1943, he became the first secretary or the leader of the Communist Party. Also in 1943, the Italian offensive completely collapsed and they retreated because Mussolini was such an incompetent idiot. But at the same time, when they went back, their allies, the Germans, came and started occupying all of Albania instead of them. But a year after that, Hoxha and his Communist Party were able to defeat the Nazi Germans and drive them out of Albania, becoming the only countries in Europe to do so without the assistance of the Allies, except for neighboring Yugoslavia. So of course Hoxha became a very popular figure by being in charge of the party that drove out the Nazis, and he became the de facto leader of this country, and he would hold on to this position for more than the next 40 years. When Hoxha inherited the country, this country was in complete ruins after World War II. Tens of thousands of people had been killed, more than 100,000 people were homeless, and all the buildings all around the country were destroyed. So the first thing he tried to do was to modernize the country, and he did some good things to an extent. He increased the literacy rate of Albanians from less than 15% to more than 90%. He brought women into the workforce, and that was very critical because up until that point, in a lot of places in Albania, especially rural Albania, women were often seen as property of men and they were not allowed to work. He electrified the country, bringing electricity everywhere else, and he brought a lot of advancements in terms of infrastructure. But all of this came at a very, very big cost. He had to change the country fundamentally to make it a communist country. He classified all his opposing politicians and former government members as war criminals and had them executed. In order to minimize any sort of political dissent, he classified their families as also enemies of the state and sent them to exile. He ended up crushing the middle class completely and exiling a lot of landowners too, because you know, in communism, private property can't be a thing, and people who used to own property now became a problem. So Hoxha was a huge fan of Stalin and his brand of communism, or Stalinism as it's called. And he was basically his sidekick and wanted to do everything that Stalin did. When Stalin split up with Yugoslavia and had a riff with them, Hoxha did the same, and that was really bad, because that meant that Albania was surrounded now on all sides, on the north and east, and in the south, by enemies of the state. Now you have to remember that Stalin was one of the most murderous men in history. It's estimated that he killed up to 20 million people with his paranoia and his crazy policies. When he died in the 50s, he was rebuked by the USSR itself, but Hoxha refused to do that, and Stalin stayed a national idol in Albania up until the collapse of communism 30 years ago. So there was this place a few blocks from here where you used to be able to find statues of Stalin and Lenin, not as a way to celebrate them, but more as a way to remember that these figures were unfortunately celebrated. I found that they've moved that recently and moved to this building literally right behind me, where you can see them from inside the gate. You're not actually allowed to go inside and film them, but I managed to get these shots. So like I was saying, Stalin is probably the most paranoid leader in modern history. He was constantly worried about his colleagues or his friends or his co-workers double-crossing him. And every couple of years, he basically had everyone in his cabinet killed or purged, as it's called. And Hoxha basically did the same. He basically started in 1948 with his deputy prime minister, because he was concerned that this guy was trying to take over the country and double-cross him. He had him tortured, had him confess to a lot of crimes in prison, and then had him executed. Hoxha had 7 different interior ministers in charge of carrying out these purges. Ironically, all 7 of these interior ministers were purged or killed or exiled themselves. So he wasn't only paranoid about people inside his own country double-crossing him, he constantly lived in fear of Western powers trying to topple his regime. Now in the early days, it was true to some extent, the propaganda, whatever he was worried about, but then it got way out of hand. He was convinced that everyone in the country that he didn't like was a Western agent, and he was convinced that the whole Western world was intent on destroying Albania with nuclear weapons and chemical weapons, when most of the Western world honestly didn't even care about Albania. So because of his paranoia, he started training the whole country to take up arms in case of an invasion. So Hoxha even started training 12-year-olds at school on how to use a rifle to defend their country. And in the most symbolic gesture, he built 170,000 bunkers like this all across Albania in order to prepare the country for an invasion that was never going to come. It's crazy to think, but there's actually 3 different bunkers inside this very small park that I'm sitting at right now. Now this bunker is cool and all, but to show you the true extent of his paranoia, we're gonna have to go a little bit out of the city, 5-10 kilometers that way, to see probably the craziest, or one of the craziest things I've ever seen. So I want to take a minute today and talk about Epidemic Sound, which in my opinion is the best platform out there for content creators like us to musicalize our videos or any other sort of content without getting copyright penalties on the stuff we make. Epidemic owns 100% of the rights to all the music on their platform, so you'll never get your video claimed or removed at any point in the future. They have a catalog of over 35,000 tracks, all of which is produced by professional musicians, and over 90,000 sound effects, which also comes really handy when you're making videos like me. The good news is this year I partnered with Epidemic Sound to bring you a massive Cyber Week discount on their music services. So if you sign up now using the link in my video description, you get a 30-day free trial and an extra 2 months with 75% off. Note that this discount is only valid for personal plans, and it's only valid for 5 days from today, from when I make this video. And after that, you still get a 30-day free trial if you use the link in the video description. So make sure you don't miss out on this offer and on Epidemic Sound's diverse music catalog. Epidemic has been my go-to place for finding copyright-free music for the last like 2.5 years now, and I could not be happier. All the music that you see me use today in this video or any other video that I've made recently that I've been able to monetize was possible because of Epidemic Sound. So go check it out. So a bit outside the city, hidden in the hills, is this massive nuclear bunker that was built by Hoxha in the 70s as his safe place in case war ever broke out and someone invaded him, which no one was ever gonna do. It's essentially a 5-story palace with like 106 rooms for the military to basically set up base for Hoxha and his staff and his top generals to discuss what to do during a war. And now they've turned it into a museum that you can go and see. You see all these layers of doors to protect from a nuclear attack, basically. You also see a decontamination chamber with a shower. So there's a lot of interesting rooms here, but I think this is one of the more fascinating ones, where there are all these gas masks that the country created to protect them from like potential mustard gas or chemical weapon attacks that never arrived. So in 1953, Hoxha's personal hero, Stalin, died, and soon after that, the next person that came in power of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, actually came out and in a secret meeting, which became not so secret later on, denounced Stalin and his cult of personality. He said that the way Stalin was doing things was not the real communism. He was basically just trying to do whatever he could to make his own brand bigger. So Khrushchev changed the direction of the USSR, tried to make it a bit more decentralized, made it a bit more liberalized, and all of this infuriated Hoxha because this guy, like you remember, was obsessed with Stalin. So China at the time was also a communist country in heavy isolation, and they were also against the de-Stalinization or the decentralization of economics that the USSR was going for. So they joined together with Albania to condemn the USSR as not real communists anymore. Take a second to process that. This guy came out and said that the USSR were not real communists. So USSR soon cut off aid to Albania, and very soon all formal relations between Albania and the USSR were abolished. At the same time, China under Mao became Hoxha's best friend and Albania's only major ally. And this was convenient for both China and Albania because Albania needed a foreign ally to sort of show that there are other people in the world that they're real communists, and China needed an ally in Europe because they didn't have any. But there was problems with this. So Albania, most of the country is very mountainous and doesn't have a lot of arable land. As a result of that, Albania previously depended largely on USSR for food imports. Number two, a lot of the industry that Albania heavily depended on for its economy, heavily depended on technology and engineers from the USSR. So as a result of this, when these ties were cut off, the living standards fell considerably and Albania suffered a lot. But in 1970s, China also started rethinking their policy of isolationism and their brand of communism, and it started opening up a bit more. And then in the early 70s, the US President Nixon paid an official state visit to China. This obviously really angered Hoxha because to him and to his philosophy, the West, and especially the US, was the ultimate enemy, and they thought that China was betraying Albania and that China wasn't even real communists anymore. So he denounced China publicly. As Mao died, China moved towards an even more open policy than it used to have with communism, and eventually in 1978 it cut off all aid to Albania. So finally Albania had no real ally left because they thought they were the only real communist country in the whole world. And more importantly, it didn't have a single major trading partner left. And it entered probably the most harsh phase or the worst phase of its recent history for the next 10 years or so. So as the communist countries in Eastern Europe started to get more liberal, Hoxha started getting more and more paranoid and started feeling more and more insecure about his hold on Albania. So he started repressing his own people even harder and isolating them even harder. He banned all foreign investments or any sort of borrowing from other countries. He tried to ban basically any Western influence in general, Western music, Western books, whatever you called it. In a very interesting rule, he banned Western hairstyles. So men were not allowed to have long hair and they couldn't have a beard, which is kind of crazy. Another interesting story I heard that there used to be like a barber basically at the airport. At this time, not a lot of foreigners were able to come in. It wasn't very open, but the approved foreigners, if some of them ended up coming without the right hairstyle or beard, then the airport official barber gave them a haircut on the spot to make sure they followed the code of conduct. So this law with the beards was passed with another intention too, which is to like curb the spread of religion, because beards were common in the Islamic faith and the Eastern Orthodox faith. So Hoxha had basically been against religion from the very beginning, but in 1967 he completely outlawed practicing religion all over the country. So there were more than 2,000 mosques or churches at the time in the country, and he either had all of them destroyed or had them converted to cultural monuments. So this big mosque behind me, the Bey Mosque, was converted to a cultural monument. The mosque, if you remember from my video in Girocaster, that was converted to a training grounds for circus acrobats. The mosque, if you remember from my video in Shkodër, that didn't even exist back then. That had to be like built after communism fell. Muslim and Christian clerics across the country were being exiled and sometimes executed. People were not even allowed to have religious names anymore. So at one point they basically came up with a list of names that was not okay to have and a list of names that was okay to have, and people had to officially change their names to satisfy Hoxha's crazy wishes. One of the most famous people to come out of Albania is Mother Teresa, the Nobel Prize winner and a saint of Calcutta as she's called. So she had an Albanian family who was stuck inside the country. The whole time Hoxha never let her inside the country because he was paranoid, and he kept saying that no, this is a Vatican spy or a Western spy sent to destroy the country. So Mother Teresa's mom and sister died inside the country without being able to be close to her daughter or her family members. And this is just the case of Mother Teresa, who is a very famous person who probably had a lot of influence. And you can rest assured this happened to a lot of other people too. A lot of people died without ever getting to see their family who are stuck outside or inside the border. So Hoxha's regime basically made it illegal to consume any sort of media information that wasn't directly disseminated by the state media or the propaganda. So lots of people were jailed for listening to foreign radio stations or having like foreign magazines. A lot of these people were sent into labor camps, exiled, or just killed for these crimes. And all of this was carried out by Hoxha's terrifying secret police, or the Sigurimi. And at one point, 1 out of 3 Albanians in the whole country had either been interrogated by the Sigurimi at some point or incarcerated and sent to prison. Not only would they like imprison someone and send someone to jail, they would classify the entire family of that people as like the enemy of the state. So these people were now under either house arrest or could not go to university and lost a lot of privileges that like normal citizens have. So it was pretty crazy. So not too far from the main square of the center is this building called the House of Leaves, which got its name from being covered by trees in the front with like leaves that sort of obscured the views of what's exactly happening in there. This building actually used to be the headquarters of the Sigurimi, or the state police that terrorized the whole country for more than 40 years and kept all citizens in fear. Today it's a museum, so you can go in and you can actually take a look at how exactly they bugged the whole country, how exactly they spied on all the people, how they brought people in there and interrogated people. They even described some of the torture techniques and everything in there, so some of it is a bit grim. But the most terrifying thing of all for me was that they explained how they had a system of 15,000 informants across the country to keep track on everyone. So there was no one you could trust, because there was probably an informant in every friend circle or like some large family group. So you couldn't talk about the state negatively anywhere. So one of the things the Sigurimi is trying to do was to stop people from escaping the country, because that, like I mentioned earlier, became an act of treason. After 1968, no one was allowed to leave the country unless they went outside the country for official business of the government, doing something for the government. So if anyone tried to escape or did not come back when they were supposed to come back, the consequences of that were they're either imprisoned or sometimes killed. And now you're thinking, okay, if someone escapes or they don't come back, they don't have anything to risk. But if someone did that, then whoever escaped, they would put like 3 generations of their families in prison instead of them. So if someone could have escaped, let's say from a village, it's like your 2nd or 3rd cousin, you might end up going to prison for that person. So people couldn't go in or out. Information obviously couldn't go in or out. Eventually, after they cut off trades with China, even like money couldn't go in and out. So this country became as isolated as you can be. So eventually Hoxha died from natural reasons in 1985. and he left the country in a state of fear and isolation. Fear of people inside the country, fear of the outside world. His successor was a man named Ramiz Alia, who basically wanted to follow in Hoxha's footsteps and keep doing what he was doing, as he was a part of the political apparatus that ran this country for so long. But later in the 80s, basically, communism was falling all across Europe. And in some neighboring countries like Romania, it was falling violently with the deaths of the dictators. So Alia tried his best to liberalize some policies to stop him from having the same fate as Romania's dictator. But nothing would work. In 1990, he finally let people travel outside the country for the first time. And when that happened, people started learning more and more about how repressive this country was and how bad things were over there. So anger was building up. And in 1990, the first ever protests broke out against the government in the city of Shkodër. And then in 1991, amidst all the protests, people gathered right here in the square, in Skanderbeg Square, around this huge statue of Hoxha that was put up right there, basically, 100 meters from here. And then this huge mob, in a crowd of rage, brought down the statue of Hoxha. And this, in a sense, symbolized the fall of communism in Albania. A year later, there were public elections democratically held for the first time in forever, and the Communist Party was defeated and voted out. Around a year after that, Alia, the guy who was running the country after Hoxha, was sent to prison for his crimes against the state of Albania and the people of Albania. And in a sense, that's where communism ended in Albania. But things didn't instantly get better. A lot of people never ever got justice. There were thousands and thousands of people who were probably kidnapped by the state and sent to forced camps or killed that no one ever found out about. Family members or kids of people that disappeared 30, 40 years ago that are still looking for answers, that are still trying to just find out, trying to have some clarity about what happened to their loved ones, just trying to have some peace, but they don't know. There's probably no one that will ever know, because a lot of the records that would incriminate the party, the Communist Party, once communism was going down, a lot of these records were probably destroyed by the same party, so they could not be incriminated. So it's hard to find these answers, and some of these answers will never be found. So people still think there's a lot of justice left to be done for the people that suffered because of the state, to the people that haven't paid the price and were involved in the state apparatus. And even though the country technically opened up overnight, isolation had its effects. This country went through the most drastic change any country has ever seen in recent history. Up until the end of communism, the public wasn't allowed to own private cars. So there were like 600 cars in the whole country. When things opened up, thousands of people came in with cars, and no one even had a driver's license because there was like no system for giving the public a driver's license. So people were just like driving around the streets, not following any rules, not following any laws, because there weren't a lot of cars. People had Coca-Cola for the first time ever. It was this brand new foreign object to them. They'd never seen a Coca-Cola. One very interesting story that this guy I met here told me was that apparently there were no bananas in Albania until the end of communism, so the early 90s. If you think about it, every country in the world probably has bananas now. But it's only produced in like subtropical or tropical climates. So if you cut off trade from the rest of the world, you don't have bananas. So all of a sudden, after the fall of communism, bananas made it to Albania. This guy that I met told me when bananas came into the country, his grandpa, who kind of like was an older adult at this point, basically grew up his whole life without seeing any bananas, and he just didn't trust bananas. It was too foreign to them. It didn't look anything to him like any other fruits he'd ever seen. So all these crazy stories make you realize how much of an adjustment people really had to make in that time. A lot of people are still struggling to make that adjustment to this new world, because if they grow up under Hoxha's regime, where they didn't know anything about the world, this is still a lot to take in as an adult. But slowly but surely, Albania is making a lot of progress. There's so much more tourists now than there were 4 years ago. And there should be, because it's got like the prettiest beaches, really gorgeous mountains, really hospitable people, really good food, and it's cheap. So I think this place is gonna really blow up in the next couple of years. So come here before it gets too crowded. Alright, that is gonna be it for this video. I tried my best to cover the story of Albania in this very, very short video and tried to do it justice. But if I made any mistakes anywhere, please feel free to correct me in the comments, and I'll probably add something to the video description correcting my mistakes if I have any. If you want to learn more about this, There's a lot of really good books about it. There's one book I really like about the Balkans that covers the history of the last 2 centuries. It's like 800 pages long, but I would recommend that. That's a really good read. And I think it's very important to understand the history of the neighboring countries in order to understand what happened in Albania, especially right before communism, because you can't like separate the histories of these countries from each other. They're very much interlinked. If you like the video, don't forget to like the video. If you want to see more videos from me about Albania in general, I made a lot of video about the beautiful places, about just the less depressing history of Albania, and about the food and all kinds of stuff. Feel free to follow me on my Facebook page or subscribe to me on YouTube. And if you want real-time travel updates from wherever I am, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Nadir on the go. I'll catch you guys on the next video from I don't know where. Maybe Macedonia, maybe Albania. Let's see. Sorry? No, YouTube.
YouTube?
Yeah.
What's your name in YouTube?
Nadir on the go.
Yeah?
Nadir on the go.
Okay, subscribe.
Thank you. Follow me in there. What's your name?
My name is Ray.
Ray? Okay.
Yeah.
Friendly guy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, bro. Okay, goodbye. People are so friendly.